Parents who encouraged me to read, who accepted the fact that maybe my Spanish wasn't all that good, but my English was going to be wonderful because they were letting me read everything that was in their house, magazines, newspapers. Both sets of grandparents were like that. You know, I was a very lucky young man to have that. A young child to have that. I found mysteries in that library. I found Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, James Cain, The Postman Always Rings Twice. I found those kinds of books, and I'm sure that that had a lot to do with the fact that my first novel was a mystery many years later. Later, when I did come, when I was in college at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, I found another wonderful library where Camila used to work. And in that library, it wasn't so much the fiction, but the expansion of my mind into ideas and trains of thought and philosophies that were to this chavalito from this little town in southern Colorado who was like the first one in his family to get to college. Actually, I have a cousin who's about my same age. She was in college at the same time. So we, different school. We were there, and this library just continued this trip that I was on. And not only was I writing at that time poetry and short stories and trying to impress my professors with my ambiguous theories of literature, to be polite. Like most college students, I was full of it, you know. And I wanted to write so badly, but I didn't really know what to write about. But I'll tell you, spending time in that library certainly gave me plenty of ideas and things that I needed to know. So in that library, I learned the way to find the truth about things that were important in those days, like the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and Chicano history. And it was also during those years where, of course, I first discovered the fact that there were writers who had names that I could be more familiar with. And so I was lucky to finally discover Rudy Anaya and people like that. And of course, that was a tremendous experience. So, I made a turn in my life leaving CSU. And I'm getting to the characters, I really am. I went to law school. And in those days, this was 1970, right? It was a political decision on my part. There were numerous students in the late 60s and early 70s in this state, as there were around the country, especially in the Southwest, who had agitated for change on the campuses. We took over buildings at Colorado State University and demanded that there would be more students of color admitted, that there would be more professors of color hired, that there would be classes that we could understand and relate to. We teamed up with the Black Student Alliance and made aggressive overtures to the administration at CSU about change and what was required. So, although a lot of change happened and things moved forward, many of us who came to the end of our years there in college decided that we needed to keep doing more. And so there were several Chicano students from around the state who had belonged to various student groups who decided that one way to keep things happening was to become a lawyer and to fight for our people's rights in the courts. And it was very idealistic, but it was also very important. And I was amazed that in my law school at Boulder there were so many students who had been active, who had taken part in marches and demonstrations, and who now were going to turn to the law and try to change things using the legal system. And what that has to do with my writing is simply that my writing stopped. I went to law school for 3 years, didn't write a piece of fiction or prose or poetry. And then for a dozen years afterwards, I didn't touch that creative part of my brain. Although I was being pretty creative in the courtroom, I think. And some of the judges let me know that, too. And my briefs were the extent of my writing. And if you ever read a lawyer's brief, you know it's not brief for the first thing. And you also know that it can be complex, and the writing can be stilted and formal, and it's just a mistake for lawyers to write that way. And one thing I try to do in my job is encourage lawyers to loosen up when they write, because you're not writing for a law professor anymore, you're writing for a human being who happens to be a judge, and you've got to communicate with that person like you need to communicate with your next door neighbor if you want something done about that tree that's hanging over your fence. So, anyway, I didn't write for a dozen years. I started to get burned out on my job. I started to realize that the change in the world that I thought I was going to make wasn't going to exactly happen overnight. And it was getting harder and harder, and times were getting tougher and tougher, and so I convinced myself I was burned out and I needed an escape. And one of the things I did was to go back to fiction. I wrote a short story about a burned out legal aid lawyer of all things. And my imagination just went wild and created this character who eventually became Luis Montes in my novels. But that short story, I got it published, and I was validated. You know, I said, okay, that was really very cool to see that story in this magazine that published it with my name, and I just want to do more of that. So I worked and worked and worked, and I wrote this novel. Again, my imagination turned loose. It had to do with Chicano students in college involved in the movement. I wrote that story, and as I was writing it, I realized it was a mystery, and it was crime fiction. I didn't set out to do that, even though in the back of my head I remembered all those books I had read years before about crime. But I understood that what I had written was a mystery, and so that was the way the Ballad of Rocky Louie started. Thank you. Now, I've created from that initial character of Luis Montes several other characters over the years, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about them. Louis, first of all, is I have 5 books about Montes, and they're short books, but together, you know, we've got more than 1,000 pages about this guy. And the arc of the novels trace about 10 years in his life, starting from, you know, when he's just about 40 to 10 years later. And I'd like to think that Montes starts off probably as a guy that, although Rudy and I might like to hang out with him, not too many other folks would. He's, you know, he's got a lot of bad habits, and he's not exactly, you know, the idea that maybe would want to be presented of a Chicano professional, if you know what I mean. He has his faults, but but I write about human beings. I don't write about stereotypes, or I try not to, and I don't want to be too much of a cliche when I write these characters. So Montes, at the beginning of the series, is in one place, and I do believe at the end of the 5 books, he's grown and changed and moved on. And really, there was nothing more for me to say about him at the end of the 5 books, so that series has stopped.